show. Joining us tonight is Wendy Priestley from the Investors Club and Aaron Greaves from the Omni Wealth. If you've got a question about property and want their expert advice, give us a call on 1300 30 34 35. Now, Aaron, you brought a few graphics along to describe some of the different properties and some of the kind of rent returns and capital growth. Do you want to take us through some of those numbers, and we'll pull them up on the screen?
Sure. The first example I've got there is a $400,000 property, and what we're showing here is the actual cost to holding a property. Most people dramatically overestimate the actual cost of holding property. What we've got here is a $400,000 property with a 10% deposit plus costs. You've got a $360,000 loan, and we've assumed interest rates of 8% interest only on there. We get rents of $400 per week with standard rental expenses, you know, your agents' fees, body corporates, if it's an apartment, etc. There's two lines I always show clients. One is your pre-tax cash flow, which is the amount of rent you receive minus your mortgage costs and rental expenses. And then there's the after-tax cash flow, or the actual cost of holding that property. And you can see it's only $9,240 a year, or that equates to about $177 per week. Like I said, most people think it's going to be much, much more than that.
Yeah. And certainly if there's other things like depreciation in there, then that can help. Absolutely. What are some of the ways, like with tax, you can actually get your money kind of monthly rather than yearly, can't you?
That's right. You complete a tax variation form, ultimately. So you apply to the ATO. It's almost like doing a tax return. And you tell them, based upon this year, I'm going to have these deductions, which means my taxable income will be less. They notify your pay officer at work, who will now tax you at your reduced taxable income as opposed to what you're currently paying. Therefore, you get the tax benefit throughout the year.
Yeah. And, I mean, obviously that's Aaron's numbers. Do they make sense to you, Wendy? Is that a typical kind of investment, or a investment that you can buy around Australia?
Yes, it's a medium-priced property, good rent return, and the holding costs are, you know, in comparison to other things, a good investment into your long-term future.
Now, obviously getting into an investment like this, it is for the long term. What kind of mindsets do people need to get into to become a property investor? Well,
our view is that it's not a hobby. Many people, you know, 75% of taxpayers who declare that they own a property own one property, and usually treat that investment property like they do their home. So they'll often wander to, in terms of looking at an investment property, they'll go, could I live here? Wrong thing. If you're not a tenant, then don't consider that you'd live there, because what's happening is that a lot of property investors, mum and dads, they've lived in homes and they think that that's where tenants live these days. But increasing is the desirability and the demand for medium density and units rather than houses. And so in Sydney this last year, over 50% of properties sold were units, and so that's where the demand is. So if you're looking at the long term, that's where you really need to go for good returns.
Aaron, we mentioned tenants before. They're not all golden little angels and don't always pay their rent on time, and yep, sometimes disappear. So we'll pull up your next numbers, because they've actually got in there a 3-month vacancy, so that's we can actually see what difference it makes.
Well, vacancy is the one thing that clients fear about the most. They have a fear that they're not going to be able to get a tenant, and that between tenants they're going to be vacant for a long, long period of time. But when you run the numbers, if we look at a 3-month vacancy, we can see that the property that cost us $9,240 per year, it now only costs us $11,970 after tax, or $230 a week. So at the end of the year, after you have applied your tax benefits, you can see the result actually wasn't that bad.
Yeah, and we'll actually jump to the next one as well, because the previous one you were saying like 8% interest, which is higher than it is at the moment. This next one is actually 9%.
That's right. Interest rates are by far your biggest risk here. When you borrow money to invest, it's the one thing you need to manage the most. You can see that in the same example on this $400,000 property with a $360,000 mortgage, if your interest rates went to 9% or 1% increase on the 8%, you can see your cost, or after-tax holding cost, is now $11,760. That's the same as a 3-month vacancy rate. And the chances of a 1% increase, I believe, are far higher than a 3-month vacancy rate, particularly in this market.
And certainly at the moment, a lot of people are paying 7%. So this is really saying, even if we get 2% of rises, which some people think that we might get, that's still reasonably affordable for a lot of people in Australia.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned, obviously, there are some of these risks. How do you try and mitigate some of these risks?
The vacancy risk all comes down to research. ultimately, when you buy a property, buy in an area where there's high rental demand and high yields. You can see low vacancy rates. SQM Research is a great tool to use, and you can put in the postcode there and it will tell you the vacancy rate at that time. That helps you identify that. With interest rates, if you are interest rate susceptible and you cannot afford interest rates to go to 9%, then you should look at fixing either part or all of your loan.
Yeah. Now, Wendy, in the Investors Club, they talk a lot about helping the average Australian. Can the average Australian actually afford a few properties?
Look, what we're looking at doing is building those properties over time. So we're not looking at buying them all at once. If you're on average wages, $60,000, and you have equity in your own home, 2 people working, then yes, would you be prepared to put aside, $100, $200 a week to hold a property that's going to give you, say, $400,000 in 10, 12 years down the track? When you look at it in the long term, it seems to me a good deal, particularly when you consider that people will pay $150, $200 to own a $30,000 car that might depreciate in 5 years to nothing.
Or go on holiday or do all these, pay the bakies and all the rest of it. Yeah. So when it actually comes to setting retirement goals, how good are people at doing that?
Look, people are not very good at setting goals. However, in the Investors Club, we have some strategies that help people set their goals for long term. We have a way of looking at that. We suggest to people that you select an income that you would like, and here is an example that if you'd in retirement you'd like an income of $60,000. Normally the industry looks at having that figured by 20 as the equity base that you need in the longer term. If you look at that being provided by property, you would buy a number of properties over a number of years, maybe then in the long term, 7, 10 years, that 1.2 million then grows to 2.4 million. You could do that by, say, 3 properties over the 400,000 that we were just talking about a few moments ago.
Yeah, and we've actually pulled a few figures out as well, which we'll jump to now. So the whole idea is that if you got, say, 2.4 million in, say, 10 years' time, and effectively that's growing at, say, 7%, then it'll go up to 2,568 and 2,748. Your mortgage is 1.2, so in these numbers we're assuming that you'd actually borrowed 100% of the money, but in reality the chances are you're not going to have borrowed all that. And so what we're saying is if you could actually draw the equity out, so by year 11 you've actually taken 60,000 out, by year 12 you've taken another 60, actually looking at the rent, and we've looked at a net rent of about 4%, you're actually still going to be cash flow positive, and that cash flow is actually still building even though you're taking $60,000 a year out.
The trick is not to take, not to be too greedy, but to take, treat your properties, they're growing, and so you don't want to take 100% of the growth. So you just take a small percentage of the growth, and then, yes, you can choose to either capitalise your interest, which in this case for living purposes would not be tax deductible, or use your rent as it's growing to pay for the interest costs, and as you can see, as the time goes on, you could even live on some of those rents.
And so effectively what people are doing here is they're actually borrowing their income. Now this goes completely against everything our parents taught us. It's against the banks, it's against accountants, against financial planners, but it works, doesn't it?
It does, but people don't think it's so different when they go and borrow to buy a car. But when it comes to this sort of example, it is foreign, it is a different approach, yet people have been homeowners and they've always borrowed money to borrow for their home, but sometimes they can't make that transition as a business. A business owner will go and borrow money to make improvements, to buy the car, the photocopier, the computers. This is how people should really focus on owning investment property in a business mind.
Because standard thinking is if you want to retire, you've got to pay off your debt and you live off the income. Whereas this strategy is actually increasing your debt and not living off income, you're actually living off debt.
Yes, it goes back to looking at the proportion. We would not be recommending people live on unusual high levels of debt, but debt that's sustainable. This is debt that's sustainable. Your income's rising, your capacity to borrow, as people would borrow to make improvements in their own home. However, then they'd have to pay that off, out of their own after-tax dollars to make improvements for the pool or the extension. Here we're looking at owning multiple properties, drawing a small amount of equity out, and you've got tenants who are paying for it. So much more safe position than borrowing and putting everything on the house.
And the key is the proportion. So if you're making $100,000 of capital gains, it's maybe borrowing 30 or 40% or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, Aaron, you're nodding there. This must go against everything that financial planners are taught from day one at school, isn't it?
Yeah, the general industry, it definitely does. Wendy's got a good point. If you're in that client in that example, if you've had $1.2 million for 10 years, you're relatively comfortable with holding on to debt. So, you know, there's a general belief out there that when you do retire, eliminate all debt straight away and then just live on the net equity that you have. But there's many people who just cannot afford to do that. If they did that, they'd have a very small asset base and their assets would run out long before they pass away ultimately. So a strategy like this, we call it a parachute strategy. So we have some growth assets that sit in the background. They do grow over time, and if we do need to eat into the equity a little bit, then we're okay with that as long as it's not too much.
Now, obviously a strategy like this, it isn't kind of standard thinking. What kind of mentality of people do you need to do this? Because you need to be pretty responsible with your own finances, don't you?
Absolutely. You need to be disciplined. Ultimately, when you come across clients, you know the ones that are disciplined and the ones that aren't. The ones who have saved and can show that they've good savings over time, you know, are relatively disciplined. And again, a client who's had 10 years, $1.2 million worth of debt over that period of time, has grown a property portfolio successfully, may not have the accessible income through other sources, but would know how to manage that portfolio.
So, Wendy, what are some of the things that you can teach your people coming into your club to actually try and make them disciplined? Because I'm sure they're not all perfect when they start out.
Well, no, look, we all have our failings and our skills, but to own property or to own a business, if you own a business that had a base of a couple of $1 million, you'd spend some time, you'd take care of the paperwork, you'd have professionals giving you advice. So too, if you're building a property portfolio, you need to be responsible. There's a lot of money going in, a lot of money going out, and you need to keep records and you need to know what your cash flow is. If you don't know what those figures are and keep them in a shoebox and hope at the end of the year that someone can sort it out, probably that's not the mindset of a good property investor.
Aaron, with some of our younger viewers, say you're kind of 20, you're recently out of school, talking about these $500,000 properties and $1 million properties, it just seems so far out of reach.
Absolutely.
What are maybe some of the first steps to try and set yourself a goal or set yourself a dream to start taking the first step?
The first thing you need to do is set some little financial goals and start achieving those. You know, the more financial successes you have, the more able you are to achieve some of the biggest successes. But yes, you need to set yourself a goal. Realistically, you need somewhere in the vicinity of about $50,000 to be able to move on a property. And the longer it takes you to save, the risk is that the further the property market will get away from you. Sometimes it's better to get into a lower price property that has some capital growth opportunity. The income will probably be better from the yield perspective, and let that help you save for the larger property into the future.
So don't get too greedy too quick.
No.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a minute, so don't go away.